We're having our second chat session related to internal auditing. Which of the following are typically governance responsibility of senior management? So when we talk about senior management, we're talking about people that are at the level of the executive. So chief executive officer, chief financial officer, maybe some key vice presidents, maybe executive vice presidents, whatever it is these are the top people within the organization. So the question becomes is, well, what are they doing in regards to the issue of governance? And what we see here is there are 4 options, and you can pick, I think you can pick 1 or 2 of them, and they were set up in such an order. But let's just kind of look through this. So the first item is delegate risk tolerance levels to risk managers. Okay? Monitor day-to-day performance of specific risk management activities, establish a governance committee of the board, and ensuring that sufficient information is gathered to support the reporting to the board. Okay, so we're actually going to talk about this in Chapter 3, and the issue becomes is, so what is the board's responsibility? What is senior management's responsibility? Well, clearly we're talking about high-level people within the organization. High-level people within the organization are absolutely not going to be monitoring the day-to-day performance of really anything. They're really looking big picture, they're looking strategy, they're looking where they need to move the organization. So number 2 is not the right answer. Number 3 is establishing a governance committee of the board of directors. Well, we'll talk about that structure in a few minutes. But the governance committee is a subcommittee of the board of directors. Okay? So as being a subcommittee of the board of directors, the group that actually establishes the subcommittee would in fact be the board of directors. So senior management is not responsible for establishing this control committee. So let's look at the last 2 items. Number 1, delegate risk tolerance levels to risk managers. And we talked about this, and we'll continue to talk about this in what we call the COSO model. So in the COSO model of internal controls, what we're talking about is the tone at the top. So the tone at the top is essentially the definition of ethics and risk and what's important, and this is going to be coming from senior management. So when we think about a control structure, a governance structure, it is a top-down approach, or it should be a top-down approach. What we're looking at here is that, in fact, senior management should be communicating the risk tolerance levels of the organization to the individuals within the organization so that everybody understands that this is how we're going to move within the organization. Okay? So number 1 is absolutely a correct answer. Now, let's look at number 4, which is ensuring that sufficient information is gathered to support reporting to the board. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Well, clearly, the senior management reports to the board of directors. Senior management creates a strategy. Senior management develops the goals of the organization. These are then basically approved by the board of directors. So from a control perspective, the senior management is responsible for reporting regularly to the audit committee or the governance committee. When I was audit director of one of the hospitals that I intimately worked with the senior management as well as the board of directors, is we met with the board of directors, I believe, 4 times a year. And basically what was taking place there is that as an audit director, is I was presenting information from a risk-based perspective, audit results, and so forth, and then management was reporting very specific things to the board of directors, through the audit committee, to essentially communicate to them what information was valuable in regards to the governance process. So when you look at question 17 here, the answer is 1 and 4. Okay, let's look at the next question. Which of the following requirements of the internal audit, which of the following are required of the internal audit function per the standards? Okay, so you look at A, evaluate annually the effectiveness of the audit committee. Well, one of the things that we need to understand is that we report to the audit committee. Okay, so the audit committee does not report to us. So it would absolutely be inappropriate to evaluate the effectiveness of the audit committee. The audit committee absolutely should be evaluating the effectiveness of the internal audit department, the control structure, but not the other way around. And frankly, if we see that the audit committee is ineffectual and we are an internal auditor, that may be a good sign that we need to change jobs, because they're in charge. We certainly are, if they ask, or if we are in a position to make recommendations, but we are absolutely not involved in evaluating the effectiveness of the audit committee. Okay, number B, issue an annual overall opinion of the adequacy of the organization's system of internal controls. This is never a responsibility of internal audit. As part of the external audit process, especially if they are complying with Sarbanes-Oxley, is they may be issuing, or they will be issuing an opinion of the internal controls over financial reporting. But that is not the function of internal audit. Internal audit is looking at the effectiveness and efficiency of specific processes, but we're not providing any type of guidance or overall opinion related to internal control. C, obtain an annual representation from management acknowledging management's responsibility for the design and implementation of internal controls to prevent illegal acts. Well, that representation, that's describing a function or a relationship between management and the external auditors, but it's certainly something that we would not be doing as an internal auditor. And question B, assess whether the information technology governance at the organization sustains and supports the organization's strategies and objectives. This is absolutely something that we should be doing. This is a very high-level process, so this sort of goes beyond looking at the internal controls or the general controls or application controls. What we clearly want to be doing at a very high level within the organization is providing an assessment of internal controls, governance, and understand the effectiveness of the IT system, making sure that we are in fact going in the right direction. So D is an example of something that the internal audit department may and in fact should be involved in. And then what we're really looking at in D, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, is what we call an enterprise risk management process. So when we start looking at risk from an enterprise level, we clearly want to think about risks from very specific areas, including information technology. Now, this doesn't mean that in an enterprise risk management, internal audit should not be driving this, but as part of our interaction with the enterprise risk management process, this is definitely something that we should be doing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Chapter 3. Okay, so Chapter 3 is really sort of setting the framework for understanding who's responsible for what within the organization. Okay, so what we have here is we have key components of governance and oversight. Now, you notice here at the top is that what we're looking at is we're looking at stakeholders. Okay, so the stakeholders here are at the top, and just kind of think about this, is in a for-profit enterprise, you would think more in terms of shareholders. Shareholders then vote on the board of directors. The board of directors then essentially create these various committees. Okay, so what we have here is we have stakeholders at the top, and then we have the board of directors here under this governance, or that essentially sustains the governance structure. Keep in mind that in some types of organizations, such as not-for-profit organizations, government organizations, is there's not shareholders, but they are stakeholders. So when we think about stakeholders, what we're thinking about is we're thinking about and discussing and talking about how these stakeholders, these people that are in charge and have a vested interest in the value of the organization, how they actually structure the governance. Okay, so the governance umbrella is based upon the board of directors. So again, it's going to be different depending upon the type of the organization, but in a for-profit enterprise, the shareholders vote on the board of directors. In a not-for-profit organization, the board of directors is established as part of the organizational structure when it initially becomes involved. Government, the board of directors acts a little bit different. They're usually appointed by someone in charge, usually someone that might be voted into office, which does create some problems, but sort of beyond the scope of what we're looking at. But in any event, the board of directors establishes the direction and the tone of the organization. As I had mentioned before, is who reports to the board of directors? Well, the officers report to the board of directors in the sense that the board of directors appoint senior management. They appoint the officers of the organization. So they're appointing the officers of the organization to develop these strategies, to follow through with the strategies, to do all the things that management does. But they don't just vote on the officers and say, okay, well, go away, don't come back till you made $1 million. No, they're interacting with senior management on a continuous basis on various the issues. But what we're really focusing on is the risk management and assurances. Okay? So you notice that risk management is within this risk management. At the top we have the board of directors. Ultimately, the board of directors is driving what's taking place. We have senior management, and senior management is then interacting with risk owners. So again, back to this whole point that we talked about before is the tone at the top. So what is the tone that is established by senior management in regards to creating a risk environment? Okay? Now, when we think about risk, let's make sure that we understand when we talk about risk, we are talking about what could go wrong, not that something actually has gone wrong. So one of the things that we are absolutely interested in is making sure that we manage these risks. And again, management is responsible for this management of risk. They're defining how much risk they can accept. They're defining how we actually manage it from the perspective of who's responsible for what. Okay? So this is senior management role, but you notice that it's under this governance umbrella. Okay, so there is a distinction then between what's happening at the board level and what's happening at the senior management level. Okay, and then senior management is then dropping down to the owners. Okay, now what we have is we have assurance services. So one of the things that the board is interested in is they're interested in making sure that management is actually providing information to them that is appropriate. Okay? So what does management provide? Well, management provides a lot of things, primarily through the financial statements, So they're providing information in terms of profit and loss and assets and liabilities to the board of directors, okay? Because management is responsible for these things, but ultimately who is most interested in it is the board of directors and finally the stakeholders. Well, the board of directors is interested in assurances that the information provided by management is in fact correct and appropriate, which is why these external activities such as an external audit comes in. It's through the external audit that the board of directors is able to objectively look at the financial statements and whether they agree that management is doing the right thing or not is irrelevant. What we want to make sure of from these assurance services is that, in fact, that information is correct. It is a fair presentation of what's actually taking place. Now you notice your internal activity. So the internal control process, and we're sort of focusing on this whole issue related to internal audit. So internal audit is providing information to the board of directors, primarily through the governance committee or the audit committee, specifically related to internal controls, efficiency, and effectiveness of the organization. So their communication with the board of directors is such that the board of directors views the audit information being provided by the internal auditors as information that validates what management may or may not be saying within to the board of directors. So we provide, and again the key word here is assurances related to these communications coming from management. Okay? So we need to understand sort of who all the people are that are involved with it. So you notice here that we have stakeholders. Well, who are some of these stakeholders? Well, certainly a owner or a shareholder is a stakeholder. They're a shareholder, they're also a stakeholder. So a stakeholder is someone that has a vested interest in the success or failure of the organization. But lenders are stakeholders. Certainly even the public is a stakeholder. In the audits and the board of director meeting that took place in government organizations that I've participated in is, in fact, these were open to the public. So when the internal audit department presented their results, or anyone presented their, or management discussed anything with the board of directors, it was done in a public forum. And why was it done in a public forum? Well, it was done in a public forum because it's through a public forum that information is communicated to stakeholders. But in the government setting, we certainly appreciate that the public is a stakeholder in the well-being of the government entity. Regulatory agencies are additional stakeholders. So people like the IRS, if you're in the hospital market, people or organizations like Medicare, Medicaid are stakeholders in the organization, not only because the Medicare and Medicaid are paying for services within for patients, but also because the hospital is actually providing services to the beneficiaries of Medicare, Medicaid. So we want to make sure that, and from their perspective, that the organization is operating appropriately. Hence, back to this issue, is senior management is communicating, but we are, through internal audit and external audit and other assurance services, providing the comfort that senior management has in relationship to the organization. Okay. So corporate governance and the certified institute there. So where is CIA, where is the internal audit department under this umbrella? And you notice that we are not a risk manager. but we are a risk reducer. We are on the right side, your side, as you look at the umbrella. Okay, so back to the umbrella. So back over here is we're over here. So we're these internal activities. We're providing assurances. Again, management is managing. Management is making decisions, and if you've taken external auditing, it's absolutely plain in the external audit process that management is responsible for the financial statements. Management is responsible for maintaining a set of internal controls. The assurance services provided by internal audit as well as external audit provides assurances not to management, but assurances to the board and the stakeholders that the information that's coming from the external auditor or coming from management is in fact appropriate. So what we're talking about here is the auditor is not the manager of risk. The auditor, what the auditor's role is in this process is to provide assurances, and what we're talking about here is that the auditor is a risk reducer. Now, why is the auditor a risk reducer? Well, as part of the audit process, and we need to understand this, is that the auditor is assessing a business unit or a function or a process, and in the process is they are not only identifying control weaknesses, but also providing guidance in terms of recommendations to address these issues. So the issue is, again, is we are attempting to reduce risk, and we're attempting to reduce risk in such a way that management is able to do a better job. But ultimately, management is responsible for these internal controls. Our responsibility is to assess these and to communicate our results to the governance committee. Okay. So back to this whole concept of risk, which I think is just a wonderful concept, and we're going to spend a lot of time kind of walking through this from the perspective of, well, what is risk and who's responsible for what, okay? And again, when we think about risk management, and we talk a lot about risk management, and we talk a lot about it, but we need to understand that we are not the management. Management is responsible for this. Our responsibility is to assess, is to provide recommendations, and to communicate this information to the board of directors, to the audit committee or the governance committee, so they can then determine if, in fact, what management is saying is appropriate information. So we talk about this enterprise risk. And first, let's just make sure that we understand this, is risk, as we've talked about, doesn't mean that something has happened. It just means that something could happen, okay? And we always have this relationship between risk and internal controls. So we want to make sure that our internal controls, in fact, reflect the risks within the organization. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, let's just, the biggest illustration or the easiest illustration to kind of think about this is we all have a lock on our front door, okay? So gone are the days when I grew up in a small town in Indiana where we never locked our door. In fact, my mother always had the front door open and the back door open in the summertime so we could get the breeze coming through the house. So we're talking pre-air conditioning days. And why did we do this? Well, we didn't see that there was a risk. Well, now the risk is we'd never leave our door unlocked because we want to make sure that something bad can happen. So the risk is someone bad to come into our house, okay? What we do is we develop an internal control. So what's the internal control? Well, we put a lock on the door. Risk management, essentially, enterprise risk management is the process where we look at risk from an enterprise perspective, okay? So it gives the example of WorldCom. at earnings risk, at operational risk. We're booking overhead expenses as capital, not recognizing earnings. Other examples you can kind of think of, pretty much any organization has risks. Now, we want to align these risks in terms of our school in and of itself. Okay, so at MSU, the risks are in the quality. The quality of our education becomes very important because if we don't have quality education, students are not going to want to come back. Safety of the students, we clearly want their risk related to students that are living on campus is immense, and we need to establish a risk environment for that. The conduct and safety related to loans, so we have student loans, expenses, university expenses, future liabilities, other funding streams. So there may in fact be risks that are coming up. In fact, just the other day, the Obama administration issued a sort of a scoring system for colleges. Well, I don't know if you've taken a look at some of the colleges in the area, but the idea is that anytime there is additional information, it creates a risk. Well, we don't know what the future issues are, but we do know that if we are attuned to the risks and how they're going to affect the organization, is that we can then develop a specific process or internal control function to make these viable, okay, to address it. So 2 examples to keep in mind. What are risks? And again, when we think about risk, we think about the chance. So you notice that we talk about chance. Chance is essentially the probability of something bad will happen. And then magnitude essentially is, if it does happen, what is the effect on the organization? So what we're looking at here is we're looking at a 2-by-2 matrix. So the 2-by-2 matrix is magnitude, how bad will it be, and chance, what's the likelihood of occurrence. So from a risk management perspective, what we want to do is we want to focus our attention on those items where the probability is high, where the likelihood is high, and at the same time, the impact that if something bad actually happens is high also. So there's always a chance that we will process a student who is not qualified, and this will result in a loss on their loan. Losses can ultimately, the way the loans work is it ultimately impacts the organization. So the chance that a student will be attacked by another student and to the university, that's a risk. The chance that the university will buy an asset and then lose it, resulting in a loss to the university. Okay? So these are just random thoughts in terms of what are risks. Well, part of the problem is if we sat together as a group, we could come up with 100. We could come up with 1,000 different things that could go wrong. Okay? Well, the problem with this is we can't really sort of chase every risk that's out there. So from the perspective of risk management, again, risk management, we think about this because we need to understand this is the responsibility of management. Management needs to understand their risk and manage these in such a way that we are addressing the big things and understanding that we're not going to be able to address everything. Okay? Very important concept. It's not only very important, but it's also very difficult to actually do that. And I've worked with organizations, and they always attempt to establish this enterprise risk management process. Everybody talks about it, but getting from the point of understanding that risks are something that we need to work with, and then actually developing a program or actually identifying where those risks are, creates a dilemma for the organization. Because again, it's really hard to think about what are the risks that are actually worse for the organization. Okay, so I think I've got this better. What is the risk? The chance and magnitude of loss. Okay, so when we talk about strategic risk, is the company going in the right direction? So we talked about Miami. Will it lose its bond rating? Will this actually happen? Well, if you lose your bond rating or the bond rating is lowered, it increases the cost of capital. And in fact, when we talk about the enterprise risk model, we're actually going to see how the capital structure is a part of the risk model that we need to address. Operating risk, can things go wrong the way we operate? And again, is there fraud in the case that management wants to actually hide what's taking place? Financial risk, what dollars are at stake? Do we have the financial resources to actually maintain the organization? Okay, so you notice here, and I want to focus on something that I think becomes very important, is there ultimately is going to be a residue risk. So you notice here that the residue risk, so let's just make sure that we understand this. You can't control every risk, okay? I always say this, and it's funny, although nobody ever laughs when I say it, but the fact is that the only people that have no risk are dead people. Okay, we all have a risk. We all have a risk. And an organization thrives on risk. In other words, if an organization is so risk adverse that they take no chances, chances are they're not going to survive, because you've got to take risk to survive. So this goes back to, on the bottom here, where we're looking at our risk appetite. So there are risky organizations, organizations that are willing to take significant risk. There are organizations that are more stable, and they're really not willing to take a lot of risk. And I would think maybe a not-for-profit organization would be one that has a low-risk appetite, a organization that is working through new technologies absolutely has a higher risk appetite, and they're willing to take risk. So the issue becomes is we manage these risks from internal controls and so forth, but at the end of the day, at the bottom, there's still going to be things that can go wrong. This is what the residue risk is, and this is where we as auditors need to understand this, but we also need to understand that this risk residue is a function of senior management. Senior management really needs to define what they're willing to do. Okay? So again, we talk about governance structure at the top, process level control, transaction level controls, and ultimately we still have some additional things that fall through. Risk, the chance or loss of not meeting the objectives. And again, back to the point, is risk doesn't mean something bad has happened. It just means that there is a chance that this will happen. So see WorldCom posted in course resources, so I will make that available. So where the earnings objectives were fraudulently met and expenses were ignored. So there are organizations, and again, trying to think about this, is hopefully we're working for a non-fraudulent organization. So when management is willing to accept a level of fraud, and in the case of WorldCom, a high level of fraud, then we're talking about a risk residue level that frankly is greater than what management can actually handle. So we're stuck with the leftover risk, or the residue risk, which is a huge if the governance controls are not in place and are not tested. Even if we have controls in place and they are tested, we still may be subject to smaller risks. Both are residue risks. So our job is to test the risk. Manage may be happy with it, but we may have to go to the board if we think it's just too great. Okay? So one of the things that becomes very interesting as we walk through the audit, and we complete our audit, we talk to management, and we say, we recommend this control, we recommend this control. since management is responsible for internal controls, they can, in fact, say, we have decided that we're going to ignore your recommendation and allow this as residue risk. Okay. They have that ability to do that, but what they need to understand and what you need to understand as the internal auditor is that this information is then communicated to the board of directors. So if they go to the board of directors, and we're both going to be in the same meeting, we're going to present the audit report. We're going to say, this is the issue, this is what they recommend. Management has responded that they have accepted this level of risk. If they communicate this to the board of directors and the board of directors is fine with that, then management is in control. They are willing to accept the risk, and the board of directors is willing to also. But what we're going to find is, in fact, we still have that responsibility. And in many cases, the responsibility is appropriate, where we will communicate to the board that management is a too high level of risk within the organization. Okay, so in the test, actually we'll be posting the answers in the book or in the course, but a couple of things to kind of keep in mind. And by the way, you do have access to the answers after the closing of the exam. So in the COSO framework, there are 4 risk responses. One is avoidance. Okay, so we want to avoid risk, which is why we have firewalls. We avoid some risky students, so we have standards in terms of SAT testing and whatever. Okay. Reduce risk. So in this case, we are reducing risk, and we actually are including a risk partner. So the insurance company is a risk partner. So the insurance company is saying, we are going to work with you in terms of managing these risks, and to a certain extent, we will actually reimburse you if, in fact, this bad thing actually takes place. Partner sharing, for example, the NSU library. So there may, in fact, be examples where we partner with other resources to, in fact, sustain a piece of the organization, and their expertise actually, we may be outsourcing certain things, but their expertise will, in fact, in what our expertise is. And then finally, acceptance. If the chance where the amount is small and the chance for loss is small, then we're just going to accept it. So, so there are certain things that we accept that may actually take place. There may be things that that go home with students or employees, and we're going to accept that. So we don't put a lock and a key on the pens and the pencils and the pads. We don't do an inventory count every night of all the pens that have that we bought. We just don't do that. So we need to understand that at some level is that we need to accept the risk, and we accept the fact that employees are working in the best interest of the organization. So what are some of our steps? We determine key organizational objectives. We identify and assess and then prioritize the risks of not meeting those objectives, determine the risk responses and treatment, and then monitor the effectiveness of the risk response and treatment. Okay, now just make sure we understand that we are not managing the risk, we are auditing the risk. But when we start talking about developing organizational goals and understanding the risks related to the objectives of the organization, this really is moving towards an enterprise risk management model. And in this risk management model, what we're actually seeing is, in fact, the situation where management is in charge of this model. But we're also a piece of this. So you notice like the monitoring. So the monitoring is absolutely something that the auditor is going to be involved with if this is in fact a piece of the overall process. Okay, so the question here is, and we'll go through a couple of questions, and I think we're going to have 8 minutes left. So we'll go through as many questions as we can, and we'll go from there. So how do you link the IFA audit and the internal audit department audit plan risk? And the answer is the internal audit function should be defined based upon an assessment of risk and exposures that may affect the organization. So what we use is we use the term a risk-based approach related to internal auditing. So we're not auditing what's convenient. We're not auditing based upon what management thinks should be audited. There is a risk assessment, and part of the first things that we want to do as a audit manager or director or chief audit executive is understand the risks within the organization. Okay? So once we've understand the risks within the organization, is we develop this audit plan. Now, keep in mind that we are developing this audit plan, but who actually accepts the audit plan is going to be the audit committee or the governance committee. So we present the audit plan to the governance committee, and they're the ones that are going to say, yep, this is what we want to do. But the point that's very critical is we are not getting approval for the audit plan from management. We're actually working outside management and actually working with the audit committee to identify the audit plan. The audit objective is to provide management with information to mitigate the negative effects or the consequences associated with accomplishing the organization's objectives, as well as an assessment of the effectiveness of risk management activities. So again, risk management, anytime you see management, who's in charge? Management. What we're doing is we are assessing, we're providing recommendations, we may be providing follow-through, but again, management is responsible. Okay, so what happens when we disagree with management? So when senior management accepts a level of residue risk, in other words, risk that they're willing to let happen, and the chief audit executive believes that this is unacceptable, what should he or she do? Okay? So the answer is we need to discuss it initially with management, and if we're still not satisfied, is that we're going to take this to the audit committee or the board of directors. Okay, so if we can work it out with management, that's fine. If we can't work it out with management, this is something that needs to go higher than management, and it's going to be discussed with the audit committee. So we have this example, is, for example, sales personnel get Hawaiian vacations for reaching sales goals, and the problem is that sales are not verified. So what should we do as a CIA, or the CAE? And the answer is that we need to talk to management. We need to help them understand what the problem is and why this lack of internal controls becomes problematic. So what this example is that I've seen, where salespeople get their relatives to buy, they get the trip to Hawaii, and then 3 weeks after the Hawaii trip, everybody returns the merchandise. Okay, that's a problem. That's a big control risk, and the control risk there is that we're not validating that these are legitimate customers before completing the sale. And I've seen many cases very similar to this that are established because to increase sales, and increase sales, everybody benefits, or at least some people will benefit. The sales reps get additional bonuses, management reaches their goals, so they're going to be bonus. So everybody's going to get the bonus. Everybody's happy, except for the fact that at the end of the day, these sales are not legitimate, and ultimately the organization is going to suffer. So if you see this as the auditor, talk to management, but ultimately your goal is to communicate this to the audit committee. Which events impact government defense contractors? And these are some of the questions here. And the issue is a political risk. So there is what we call political risk, in the sense that if you are working outside the country and you establish a contract with a government, or you have some sort of factory or something in a country where there are risks of overthrow or changes in government or a million other things, is something bad could happen, and in fact you open the newspaper one morning and you find that the government has taken over, and they've taken over private property, or maybe not even that, but maybe a political party has changed, and these contracts are now null and void. Which is not a driver for enterprise risk management? And the answer is A, future earnings will improve over the short term. So the idea is, when we talk about enterprise risk management, this is a long-term objective. This is a long-term goal. This is a long-term project. So enterprise risk management is not going to affect next quarter's earnings, but it may help sustain the organization 10 years from now. Next question, enterprise risk management is a process designed to identify potential events and to manage risk appetite, to provide reasonable assurance of the entity's objectives. So the idea is, when we look at enterprise risk management, we're not looking short term. We're looking at the entity's objectives, and the objectives tend to be much longer than short term. Okay, so we want to avoid things that are in red. That actually doesn't look too red. We want to keep in the green area and understand that there are some issues that we may accept in the yellow area, but we need to be cautious. Okay, so in the yellow area is the cautious. In red, we want to stay away from these altogether from an organizational perspective. Okay, which is not an example of risk sharing. Selling is not a risk. Hedging would be risk sharing. You're hedging with hedging is almost like insurance. Certainly insurance would be risk sharing. Partnering with another firm would be another example. Okay, let's do this last question and then we'll call it a day. The CAE is asked to lead the enterprise risk assessment as part of the organization's implementation of enterprise risk management. Which of the following would not be relevant with respect to protecting the internal audit function of independence and objectivity of the auditor? Risk owners are assigned responsibility for each key risk. Risk owners are assigned responsibility for the risk increases. A member of senior management presents the results of assessment to the board that communicates the results. Okay, a cross-section of management is involved in assessing the impact of the likelihood of risk. So the issue becomes is all are relevant to the goals of the organization. Okay, so I think we covered everything. We're a minute past. Actually, we're just right at the hour. So in any event, do you want everyone to respond to the final paper? Yeah. So if you can, if everybody can actually repost to the correct function, and again, I sincerely apologize, but I know that I've responded to other people. So in your post is if you just say you haven't responded to this, let me know if this works. I will address that accordingly. If I've already responded, just say, thank you for your response. This is what I'm going to do, and then I'll give you the points. But I just want to make sure everybody has responded to this. Okay. Okay. Where do we find the okay? So last point is, had a problem with last chat. I'm trying to fix it, but I did have a problem with it. this time should work fine. And I'm not exactly sure where they go, but I will find it. I'll make sure that you have access to it, and we'll go from there. Okay. So I will try to fix the first chat. Unfortunately, I did have a problem with that, which was my fault. Okay. So this is I really like this GoToMeeting, but there's no question but that it's there's a lot of little tweaky things that make it difficult to get it right. Okay, I'm rambling on. I apologize for that. We'll talk to each other in 2 weeks. Thank you very much for your attention and your hard work, and hopefully you're getting into the groove in terms of what we're expecting and what internal audit is all about. So thank you for your time, and we will talk soon. Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, bye-bye.